Okay, I think we're going to get started. Sorry for the delay. We had a little bit of trouble with the audio, and this is an oral history project, so the audio is of central importance. So, I am the Reverend Oscar Sinclair. Let me say at the beginning that this needs to be on. There we go. I'm the Reverend Oscar Sinclair. The reason that recorder needs to be on is that this work was done as part of a candidacy for a Doctor of Ministry degree at Wesley Theological Seminary. And this presentation is actually a piece of that degree. It is the last piece of that degree. So that's why there's a camera running over there, there's a microphone here, and there's Jim Porrigal recording as scribe, because Wesley will not believe that I've actually done this unless it is signed in triplicate. So the story of this presentation, and indeed this whole doctorate, starts in the spring of 2020, when every single professional development conference, meeting, or opportunity I was signed up for was canceled in a 2-week period. Remember those 2 weeks? March 16th. And so in the aftermath of that, I decided that I'll have a bunch of time on my hands during the pandemic. So I'm going to start a Doctor of Ministry program. And so I spent the years from 2020 to 2023 in a cohort of people talking about how we lead churches through times of transition. And while we were in the midst of this coursework, we were drawing our case studies straight from the most intense period of transition that any of us had lived through. Now, a Doctorate of Ministry, I don't think has a clear equivalent over here. The batteries of the camera have just run out. I'm going to pause for just a second. And apparently somebody in this hotel has drained every battery I brought. So
I will use my phone.
We're going to switch to a phone, and Wesley's going to deal with it, because they're actually not the most important things here. That's all of you. So a D.Min doesn't have an exact equivalent here in the UK. It's a professional degree, and the distinction that we make in the States is that a Doctor of Philosophy, so a PhD, is an academic degree, and the final thing is a gift to scholarship. That's what a PhD thesis is. A D.Min thesis is instead a gift to the church. The Wesley would say the church universal, so the church with all of us in it. But in my case, it's not just any church, right? It is this church. It is the Unitarian Church of Lincoln, Nebraska, important to say here, where I have served as the senior minister since 2017. So let me tell you a little bit about the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. It's a demographically average church for American Unitarians. It's actually geographically average. Lincoln is very hard to find on an old paper atlas because it's actually in the crease between the two pages in the middle of the country. And the city of Lincoln is two things. It's a state capital, and it's a university town. There are about 300,000 people that live in Lincoln. There's also a football stadium that seats 90,000, which on game days becomes the third largest city in the state of Nebraska. By US standards, the Unitarian church there is of average size. Now, this is by US standards. So we have about 300 members. We have about 160 people there most Sunday mornings. They describe themselves as a liberal beacon in a conservative state. And 6 years ago, going on 7 years now, after a major renovation project, they called a young, ambitious minister who had been trained at a large New York congregation with the explicit goal of growing, both in size, but more importantly, in presence in the broader Lincoln and Lancaster County community. There is a difference that they don't talk about between a PhD and a D.Min, and that's this. I love these people. The academic term is I am a participant observer in this, but what that means in lived experience is that they are my child surrogate grandparents. I have cried with them in hospital rooms. I have celebrated with them in city parks. They have been friends and colleagues and our community since we moved to Lincoln. And for the first 3 years that we were in Lincoln, we did mostly what they called me to do. Built relationships in the community, added an evening worship service, eventually a second worship service on Sunday morning. We redid our bylaws. That doesn't change from the US to the UK. That's an important thing that you have to do once in a while. We started providing childcare for meetings, put in countless extra hours to build something new. So this Unitarian Church of Lincoln is the one that I know and love. But for about 2 years, this was the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. Now, I could tell you what the pandemic was like for us. The thesis that this presentation draws on spends about several chapters talking about that. The 2 years when we were mostly out of the building. But you've all lived some version of that if you're in this room. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit to the summer of 2022. So last summer, we were struggling as a congregation. We had some really big successes early in the pandemic, right? We launched a ton of new programs. We moved the congregation into the 21st century, figured out how to do all of that in about a week and a half. But 2 years later, when we came back into the building, we were really struggling with doing the basic church stuff well. Right? Attendance, raising money, which is an important thing in my life, recruiting leaders. I spent 6 months trying to find a treasurer, which I'm told never happens here. But part of this, I became convinced, is due to the nature of the pandemic, right? So COVID was universal in its impact, but it was deeply particular in how it impacted people. So put that a different way, COVID affected everybody I can imagine, everybody I know, and everybody I can imagine knowing. But those impacts were very, very personal. The experience of a 20-year-old single parent during the pandemic was much, much different than an 85-year-old in a nursing facility. And so we've all had our individual stories of the pandemic, but what I think we were struggling with last summer was our collective story as a church. And so this was the question that I was struggling with as I started this project. How do we rebuild community and a sense of shared story? So at this point, I'm going to pause for a moment and talk a moment about trauma. Trauma is over-defined and over-talked about in pop culture. I managed to go 6 years in Lincoln without talking about it because I thought it's such an overdone topic in churches. But we're going to talk about it today. So here's a really good definition of it. This is Fisher and Reidesser's definition. They write in German, but this is in English. Trauma is an experience of a fundamental discrepancy between a threatening situation and an individual's possibilities for overcoming it. The experience is accompanied by feelings of helplessness, defenselessness, and abandonment, and can permanently disrupt a person's understanding of the self and the world. That first line, the fundamental discrepancy between a threatening situation and an individual's possibilities for overcoming it. Worldwide pandemic, sew masks out of old t-shirts. That tension, that disconnect was one of the foundational pieces of the pandemic. And so here's voices from the Unitarian Church of Lincoln describing the experiences of the last 3 years.
I get more tired more easily. I go out and do, some errands, and normally I'd be able to do that and do other things as well. And I come home sometimes and I'm just tired from doing what doesn't seem like a lot. And I'm not sure what that stems from exactly.
I'm the same way.
I sort of want to say confused, but not really confused. Maybe just kind of lethargic.
It just was more. It was just more. It just always felt like more than I could even wrap my mind around.
Isn't that funny? I actually forgot it in my mind because I have put it so far behind me because it hurt so much to have to end it that I couldn't even remember that until just now.
I redecorated my office almost as soon as we came back into the building. I got rid of all the furniture that had been in there, rearranged where everything was. And it was only recently that I put together that almost as soon as I came back into that office down there, it's like I can't.
2.5 years later.
Right. I need different chairs in here. I need the desk in a different place. And I hadn't put together that one of my last experiences with it, set up with the red chairs in a circle, was this incredibly sad,
Scary.
intense, frightening moment. So obviously I was one of those people, but we'll talk about this more later. That comes from a collection of 92 people that recorded stories over the course of this project. And a lot of the 92 describe something like those people, some kind of individual trauma. But as much as we talk about individual trauma, we might also talk about communal trauma. So there's this American sociologist, he's no longer with us, named Kai Erikson. And in the 1970s, he was an expert witness for lawsuits. He studied trauma, and so he would go and interview people after natural disasters to determine how they were functioning in the aftermath of disasters. There's this famous case that he worked on in Buffalo Creek, West Virginia. It was a mining accident. It was a mudslide that wiped away about half the town in an hour. And as he was interviewing people, he started to put together this theory that it wasn't just individuals in Buffalo Creek that were traumatized, but it was the system of the town itself that was exhibiting trauma. So to put that in concrete terms, if you're in a bowling league in Buffalo Creek, West Virginia, and your house was fine, your family is fine, but half of the people in your bowling league lost their house, the bowling league itself, and you as a person in it, may start to exhibit symptoms of trauma. So Kai Erikson came up with this definition of collective trauma. And it starts out, he says, by individual trauma, I mean a blow to the psyche that breaks through one's defenses so suddenly and with such brutal force that one cannot react to it effectively. That's classic individual trauma definition. By collective trauma, on the other hand, I mean a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of community. The collective trauma works its way slowly and even insidiously into the awareness of those who suffer from it. So it does not have the same quality of suddenness normally associated with trauma. It is a gradual realization that the community no longer exists as an effective source of support and that an important part of the self has disappeared. So this became basically my understanding of what was happening at the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. And to editorialize beyond the realm of this project, what I would guess is going on in a lot of churches and a lot of civic organizations and a lot of volunteer organizations and a lot of bowling leagues. You don't have to be somebody that lost somebody to COVID to be feeling this. So then the question becomes, what do you do about it? Another American sociologist, Scott Alexander, wrote a book called Trauma, A Social Theory, where he looked at a whole bunch of institutions and communities that had communally traumatic events, mostly wars or natural disasters. And he studied the ones that had moved through the trauma and come out the other side. And he said that they mostly have answered 4 questions internally. They talk really clearly about the nature of the pain. So what happened? To who did it happen? They talk about the nature of the victim. Who did it happen to? They talk about the relationship between the victims and the wider audience. So it happened to you. Well, how does that matter to us as a collective? And Alexander wrote that they also get very clear on who's responsible, who caused the trauma. Now, for COVID-19 in a church in Nebraska, that is beyond the realm of this presentation, so we're just going to take that one off for a moment. So the question was, how do you put together a project in a church focusing on those 3 things? How do you get a church to do those 3 things with each other? Now, quick theological digression. We talk a lot about individualism and the collective in Unitarianism. We talk about it a lot in Unitarian Universalism. For the last 10 years, every new member class I've done, anywhere I've done them, I've said some version of this. Unitarian theology is defined by 2 things, saying that all people have inherent worth and that we are all interconnected. And most of our theology comes in the tension between those 2 things, figuring out how they're both true at the same time. But a really interesting thing came out while I was researching this paper. There's a tendency in contemporary Unitarianism to claim that we are problematically focused on individuality at the expense of collective theology. All 4 of these people make that point. Now, you may recognize some of those names, you might not recognize others. Know that they are all arguing against each other, but they all make this same point. So no matter what side of the argument that they fall on, every major Unitarian thinker seems to argue that individualism is a major part of our tradition, and it is a problem. Arguing with each other about it, and ascribing the individual emphasis to the other. Ask me more about that in the questions, and I'll talk more about it in the questions. But the question that I hope we engaged with in Lincoln is, how do we blend these 2 things? How do we blend the emphasis on individual and collective responses and stories? How might we imagine a collective story as a thing made up of individual experiences? All right, so here's what we did. Over the course of about 2 months, 92 members and friends of the Unitarian Church of Lincoln interviewed each other about their experiences of the pandemic. We standardized the questions and the format. So this is show and tell. This is one of the recording booths. So in here is a welcome letter, directions with questions to ask each other, an informed consent form, recorder like the one that's running now, and a notebook for any other questions people have.
Tissues.
And tissues, we learned after the first day of doing this. And those stations also allowed off-site participation, right? So we could send them home with people, and we did over those 2 months. And then we recorded about 40 hours of audio, which is about 400 pages of transcript, which is that white binder right there. And then my project over 2 months was to edit all of that, and then to edit the audio down into pieces that we could then play back to the congregation, to say, these are the stories that you told each other. This is our story of what happened during the pandemic. So a couple reasons that we put it together that way. The first is that this is a narrative project. It's telling stories, right? Because telling the story of what happened is the fundamental piece of recovering from trauma. That is the thing that you must do. It touches on this individual and collective piece because it's individual stories but told to each other and then shared with the community. And it's rebuilding connections within the congregation because this part's really important. I was not the interviewer. I was only there for a couple that I actually was a participant in, but most of these were members of the congregation asking each other these questions. And then we played them back on November 16th. We put together a service that focused on those first three of Alexander's topics. So the nature of the pain, victims, the relationship to the broader community. And the most important part of the whole project, the whole thing, was to highlight the different experiences people had during the pandemic. How some people described it as the best years of their life, how some people described it as worse than jail. To get those people to listen to each other. So I'm going to play an excerpt from that service, but here's my ask of you as you listen to this. These recordings were not meant to be heard by strangers when we recorded them. Every person you're going to hear is somebody that I know and love, and who, when we played this first, would have been known and loved by everybody hearing it. So imagine as you're listening to this, not that it's strangers with flat Midwestern accents, but people who you've sat next to in pews for 20 years, right? People that you have drank countless cups of tea with, people who you have played with their kids and babysat them and maybe haven't seen them much for 3 years. That's the audience. This is more for Wesley than for a church audience, but we asked the 92 participants to take a brief survey after they participated. About half filled it out. And those that did reported more or less that they felt more connected to the Unitarian Church of Lincoln following the project. That's this, the graph on the left. The graph on the right is the question, did this project help you feel more connected to another member of the community? More people answered that positively than said, did it help you feel connected to the church? Now, if I put my pastor hat on for a second, I would say that this is actually asking the same question in two different ways, right? Because the church is an abstraction. The church is a building that people come to. But the church as it is experienced is another person in the community. It's the person that you're sitting down with in the moment. So this graph on the right is the important one. We also did a second survey right before and right after the November 16th service. So this included people that had participated, recorded stories, and people who were just coming to it cold and hadn't done anything with this project until that day. And we asked everyone whether or not they had participated. One, if they had understood what other members of the congregation went through during the pandemic. And that's what this is. So the left is right before the service, and the right is right after the service. So there's a movement up on that. And then we asked if you feel like other members of the congregation understood what you went through during the pandemic. And that we saw a relatively big jump. People say, yes, I feel much more understood after that. And then we also did a focus group a little while later where we had about 20 people in two groups gather to talk through the project. And so the last audio clip is excerpts from those two groups. This is a shorter piece.
what struck me was the sense of loss that some members had experienced that I was not aware of, that I was very saddened by. I didn't realize some people had gone through such deep loss.
And I was a little surprised and maybe encouraged that there were so many different ways of viewing it, of reacting to it, of feeling the effect of the pandemic, that not everybody felt the degree of loss that I might have felt.
I had not thought about COVID in terms of being a traumatic event that we faced. It's a world traumatic event. And I think about global warming, and I think that's going to be a world traumatic event, or if it isn't already. So to frame it that way maybe helps us understand where we are as a congregation now, which I think where we are right now is we desperately need reconnection. And this project was a good way to facilitate some of that, where we were talking with each other about what happened at an important time that we really weren't talking about very much when it was going on.
So I think we don't realize the depth of it until you're looking at it retrospectively.
I think the Sunday sermon really brought that home to me. I was one of the, I think, less affected people. I didn't have to worry about a job and had a nice place to stay and had Linda with me and electronic connections, and I had lots of advantages in dealing with it, and it was listening to some of the harder cases at the sermon time. It made me realize just how easy I'd had it, and maybe I'd underappreciated, how much other people suffered with it.
I just wanted to say I felt flattered or relieved to have somebody ask, how are you doing? How did it go? How did it affect you? I wrote down a list of things that I thought about what this my answers would be, and it's not really. It didn't turn out to be what I actually said at the minute. It was more low than that. It was good for me to be able to talk like that with a friend that I knew was listening.
I felt a lot of very complex feelings during it, and it made me feel closer to the church, listening to what other people were saying, because you don't normally hear what's actually genuinely in people's hearts when you just have coffee with them, or you sit next to them in the pews or something like that. But when you hear them answering those questions, I felt like I grew closer to everybody else.
I think this really underscores how important this work is, because talking about things is how you process things. And that kind of talking is how we'll recover, I think.
Okay, so what do we take from this? The first is that adaptive work is long-term. And if you're looking at that and saying, what's adaptive work, Oscar? Come to the session tomorrow where I will talk lots about what adaptive challenges are. But they're long-term problems. We don't know the full impacts of the pandemic and the response. We won't for years, regardless of this project. I'm convinced that doing this helped the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. But there won't be data to support that for a long, long time. The counterfactual is impossible to prove, so the statistician in me just says it probably helped. What we can say is that in the short term, The story appears to have resulted in deeper connections among the membership of the congregation, and that's a good thing. And so this spring I've been trying to get the project off the ground at 2 other congregations, and I gotta say, it's been tough. It's been really tough. I'm convinced that COVID can be understood as a communally traumatic event, and recording the stories from it is a way forward. But it has been an uphill battle to get this rolled out anywhere. The reason that I think it is this Judith Herman quote that I want to end with. Judith Herman wrote the book on trauma recovery. This is how it begins. This is page 1. The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. When something terrible happens, we want desperately to tell the story and have people understand what we went through. And when something terrible happens, we want desperately to forget it, to never be asked about it again, to say, that's in the past, I don't want to dwell on it, I'm moving forward. I think this is where we keep getting caught up. I think when I did it in Lincoln, it was pretty easy because everybody knows Oscar, and I was literally haranguing people in coffee hour saying, you need to do this recording. It's for your minister's doctorate. But that's a lot harder. Just presenting this project and saying, I think it'll be good. So here's what I want you to take away from this after this session. The first is that pretending that COVID didn't affect our congregations, pretending that this last 3 years didn't have a profound impact on Unitarianism, or that we're simply back to normal and nothing's changed, is just not a realistic strategy, right? This is affecting our people whether we talk about it or not. And then the second part is that by talking about what we went through, we're better equipped to move forward. And this is one way to do that. All right. So at this point, I'm going to stop talking and answer any questions. Thank you for your time. Could we leave the recording going? Okay.
I don't have a question, except maybe a very mundane question, but I just want to say how thrilled I am that you've done this and that you're talking about it, because there's a sense of the world, moving through the world, because nobody else seems to be talking about the actual effects, not just referring to it as something that happened, but the actual effects, the lived effects and the legacy of that experience. People generally don't seem to be talking about it. And so there's the sense that, oh my God, I'm aware of the impact of it, and nobody else seems to be. So is there something wrong with me? I keep it to myself. And I've just been so moved by what you presented today, and the fact that you did it, not just for your doctorate, but the fact that you did it, I think was a tremendous piece of service. And bringing it here today and talking about it, for me certainly has been. I still feel very moved by it. The fact that somebody's actually talking about it, and the personal effects, not the economic effects or anything else, but the actual sort of personal impact, because we were all troubled by it. We all faced a death threat, whether it was to ourselves or to somebody else, and you don't just get over that like that. And the fact that, trying to pretend as though we have all got over it, I think it does us a disservice. So thank you for what you've done today, what you brought today. Really.
Thank you. There's a question in the back, and then we'll come up to the front. Yes?
Should I?
Yeah, actually, why don't we take a second mic in?
Thank you. I'm very aware that invoking the Holocaust in this connection runs the risk of being seen as totally crass, and I don't do it lightly. But I am aware from my own reasonably at one point deep researches into the Holocaust in culture is that mainstream culture went through a longish phase after the Second World War of amnesia, of not wanting to face what had happened. It was very, in films it was referred to in a very coded way, and it was only really, I think in the 60s, the Eichmann trial was a kind of a pivotal point, where all of a sudden people could look at it again, and more clearly. And I wonder whether some time has to go by, in a sense, before we're able to look at it again. But then the worry is, it then became all anyone ever wanted to talk about. And you can swing around and it can become almost overstated. So I think looking at it at an early point is, psychologically that's the most healthy thing you can ever do. Yeah. With abuse, with any kind of devastating event, look at the wound, pay attention to it now. But I just wonder whether 10 years from now there'll be a kind of revisiting of the pandemic and what it's done to us.
The question of how we remember and how we memorialize is really important, right? Because there's this early poem about the Holocaust that begins, "There is no monument at Baba Yar." There is no monument to this absence that happened. And that's not the case anymore, and it's been really intentional to build those monuments and that memory. I think one of the distinctions that I wonder about is the First World War. So Lincoln, Nebraska, one of our favorite sons is John Pershing, who was the general in charge of the American Expeditionary Force. So there are monuments to World War I all over Lincoln. Many more Nebraskans died of the Spanish flu epidemic than died in World War I. And the Spanish flu pandemic is misnamed because epidemiology, it started in Kansas. It started 100 miles from Lincoln, Nebraska. There are no monuments to that pandemic in the state. So I think it's an open question culturally if COVID-19 will look more like World War I or more like the Spanish flu. I certainly hope that we don't forget it. There were two questions over here, and then we'll come over here.
I think I'm probably echoing Stephen here, but it's occurred to me whilst I've been listening to this talk. Between March 2020 and 2022, I signed into several seminars and lectures and so on about what to do when the pandemic was over. We were going to rebuild our churches, we were going to make oodles of money, we were going to let all our premises off, we were going to achieve miracles, we were going to be wonderful. And really, we were doing the wrong thing. We were asking the wrong questions. We were not allowing for this period of recovery to take place. We were just trying to force ourselves onwards, and we talked about what it would be like to be back to normal. And a few of us were saying, we're never going to be back to normal in that sense. It's going to be a different world, and we've got to be different to fit in with it. And it is a different world, but we have to give ourselves that space, that time to recover. We're not through it yet. We're not rid of COVID. Maybe we won't ever be. And we have to allow for it, and we have to be sympathetic towards it, and not force that pace until we're done with it.
Firstly, thank you. I wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about, you were saying that you had resistance of replicating this piece of work in another church in America, and I think and also over here. And I'm interested from what comments have come out so far from the questions. What is the resistance? Is the resistance that people are like, I don't want to talk about that, I just want to get on?
Yeah.
Or, I because to me, having done a fair bit of oral history in the past, it makes complete sense.
Yeah.
And yet, there is a questioning of what is the resistance.
Yeah. I should have taken the names out of the congregations out of this, so please, I'm not going to talk about the one in the UK. In the US, so it's my internship congregation, it's the large congregation in New York that I came out of, where they know me. And I went and preached there on January 1st and basically said everything I've just said. And had this conversation afterwards. And then just had 4 months of silence where I didn't hear back to emails I was sending, and and I've eventually heard back, and it's just people get busy. But I think nobody says this, right? Nobody says that Judith Herman quote about the tension between the need to speak and the need to forget. How that gets expressed is getting busy with other things. Nobody ever comes out and says it. And because of the nature of the thing, because these are congregations that I'm not in every day, I don't have the relationship to kind of draw that out. It really requires somebody in the congregation to sit down weekly and say, have you done this yet? One of the things that we found in Lincoln is that the first 15 or 20 interviews were like pulling teeth. I had to drive home in absolute despair with Stacy, where I was like, there's just nobody participating. This is terrible. She's like, well, don't just let them self-select into the sample. Like, go out and recruit. And so we did that. Stacy did that for several Sundays. And then after we got about 30 or 40 people, so about 10% of the congregation, 20% of who was there on Sunday, then it really picked up speed. Once the default was this is a thing that people are doing, then everybody wanted to do it. But it took a lot of pushing to get there. I think there was maybe one question over here and then one question over there.
Yeah. And if I may, Oscar also has a pie chart when it came to outreach. I have the book in my hand. That when it was getting started, what did it take to convince people to participate? And some of it was that they had to hear the message from several times to remember that this was happening. Some folks wanted to write down their answers in advance and had to be told, actually, you know what, there's a bit of going into this and just being open in your heart and just going in and not planning. And then in terms of how he outreached, he preached about it from the pulpit. He wrote the newsletter article. He did the daily update. He did directed emails. He stood with a box in his hands after the service to catch people before they left.
Begging people.
And me too, and an ambassador as well, and then at the end made phone calls. So I think you broke down like all of the outreach strategies, and there was like 11 different ways to get the message out over the course of 2 months, which, like you said.
And this is a lesson for churches, not just this project, but there were 11 things, and they all were 9% of the people responded to that one thing. So it wasn't that newsletters got the message out or preaching got the message out. It was everything. Anyway.
Thank you. Well, I echo everyone's positive thoughts about this. I'm deeply moved as well. And as I'm wondering, one, can we just steal your work, basically? Can we take your questions?
Yes,
and your...
absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And secondly, do you think there's a window of opportunity to do this?
Yes. So yes, absolutely, steal my work. I'll pull this stuff out if you want to come up and take pictures of it. That may be the most immediate, and then I will try and find out from the conference if I can upload the material anywhere. But yes, absolutely, I made this project to be replicated. I'm presenting it because I think it's important for churches, and I think it should be replicated. Absolutely. And I think there is some time pressure, right? Because the further this gets away, the more we forget. There was a moment in one of those focus groups where I was sitting in a focus group and I was facilitating it, and this was at the end of 2 months of recording all of these things. And it was in that moment I went, God, nobody mentioned the giant drive-through COVID testing site that we had. We closed down the mall for 6 months. We closed down an American mall for 6 months to have a drive-through testing site in the midst of a Nebraska winter, and we all just forgot about it. Like we all told these stories and forgot that detail. And I think that the chances of that happening more are gonna increase the more time goes on. Any other questions? All right. Well, by some miracle, we are almost exactly on time. So thank you so much. I'll stay up here if there's any other questions. I know we talked a lot about trauma. The chaplain's office is right there. There's phone numbers on it. They are happy to talk to anybody about anything. So am I. I'll stick around. Thank you so much for your time.
Just to repeat that, what's been said, I think, thank you so much, Oscar, for that presentation. It really touched people. And I think that shows how much work there still is to do and how we had a real recognition of what those stories were. So thank you very much for all that work.
Yeah.